Around 7 million years ago, in the shifting heart of Africa, a quiet revolution began. Forests that once stretched endlessly were thinning into open grasslands, and from among the trees, a small group of primates began to stand a little taller. These were the earliest ancestors of humanity, creatures like Sahelanthropus chadensis, walking awkwardly upright under the burning African sun. Their world was raw, dangerous, and untamed. Yet this simple act of standing on two legs would change the destiny of life on Earth forever. They did not know it, but this small adjustment, freeing the hands from the ground, opened the door to everything that would come. With hands unbound, they could grasp, carry, and manipulate the world in ways no creature had before. Each movement, each small step upright, was a spark in an evolutionary chain reaction that would one day create language, art, and technology. But for now, they were just surviving, scavenging for food, avoiding predators, and learning to adapt in a land where survival meant constant motion. The African landscape was transforming. Vast plains replaced dense jungle, forcing species to evolve or vanish. Walking upright allowed these early hominids to spot danger from afar and travel longer distances under the relentless sun. Their spines, hips, and legs began to change bones, reshaping slowly, generation after generation. Natural selection was sculpting something entirely new: endurance, curiosity, and a brain hungry for problem-solving. Millions of years passed. Each species that followed carried the memory of this adaptation within their bodies. Australopithecus, one of the most famous early ancestors, would inherit this gift of walking on two legs. Fossils like Lucy tell the story of a being that still looked partly ape, but moved like a human. Through the bones, scientists can trace not just posture and movement, but behavior. A species that likely gathered in groups, used simple objects as tools, and cared for one another. This early sense of cooperation would become humanity's greatest weapon. Even then, in a dangerous world of saber-toothed predators and shifting climates, they survived not through strength, but through unity. When one was injured, others stayed. When food was scarce, they shared. These primitive bonds of empathy, formed long before language, were the first flickers of what we would one day call society. As their brains grew slightly larger, their perception of the world shifted. They began to notice patterns: the path of migrating animals, the return of seasons, the shape of rocks that could break or cut. Each observation built upon the last, forming the foundation of reason and foresight. Though their minds were still simple compared to ours, they were no longer driven only by instinct. Curiosity had taken root, and with it, the earliest sparks of self-awareness. The climate of Africa continued to test every living thing. Droughts would come and go, rivers dried and reappeared, and entire species vanished overnight. Yet the ancestors of humanity endured. They migrated across landscapes, followed the herds, and adapted to new challenges with each generation. This was not just survival, it was evolution in motion, and nature was experimenting with the blueprint of intelligence. The transformation from ape to early human was not marked by a single moment. There was no clear line, no instant of creation. It was a slow, relentless process written in bone and time. What began as a simple shift in posture became the foundation for language, culture, and thought. The ability to walk upright meant they could travel vast distances, freeing their minds to imagine what lay beyond the horizon. In the bones of Sahelanthropus and Australopithecus, we see the first signs of something extraordinary beings that stood halfway between two worlds. They were not yet human, but no longer merely animals. They existed in a fragile in-between state, balancing instinct with the first glimmers of reason. From their perspective, they were simply surviving. From ours, they were becoming something miraculous. The world they knew was violent, filled with predators, larger and faster than themselves. Every step was a gamble with death. Every night a test of endurance. Yet, it was within this crucible of struggle that humanity's defining traits, resilience, creativity, and cooperation were forged. Danger demanded innovation. Fear demanded unity. And those who learned to adapt would pass their strength to future generations. Millions of years later, when we trace our lineage through the fossil record, we find echoes of these early beings within us. Our bones still carry the marks of their transformation, our instincts, their survival strategies. They are not just our ancestors, they are part of what makes us human. Standing upright was not merely an act of balance, it was the beginning of a journey toward awareness. From that first step forward, a chain of evolution began that would eventually lead to fire, art, civilization, and consciousness itself. It was the moment life learned to see itself, to look across the horizon and wonder what lay beyond. This was the dawn of humanity. A silent, staggering moment lost to time, yet felt in every thought, every heartbeat, and every question we still ask about who we are and where we came from. Around 4 million years ago, deep in the heart of Africa, a new kind of creature began to walk the land. They were smaller than modern humans, with long arms built for climbing and short legs meant for walking. Their faces still carried the features of their ape ancestors, yet there was something different in their movements, a quiet confidence, a balance between earth and sky. This was Australopithecus afarensis, the ape who walked like a human. Among them was one who would later be known as Lucy. Her fossilized bones, discovered millions of years later in the dusty plains of Ethiopia, would tell a story that bridges the ancient past to the modern present. Lucy stood only about 1 meter tall, yet she carried within her fragile frame the blueprint of everything humanity would become. Her pelvis, spine, and legs were unmistakably built for walking upright. With each step she took across the open savanna, she was rewriting the rules of evolution. The African landscape during Lucy's time was a land of extremes: hot days, cool nights, and constant danger. Vast grasslands stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with acacia trees and distant volcanoes. Herds of ancient antelope and elephants roamed freely, while saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas stalked the shadows. To survive here required more than strength. It demanded awareness, memory, and cooperation. Australopithecus lived in small groups, each member depending on the others. In unity, they found safety. Though their brains were only a third the size of ours, they were far from mindless. Lucy and her kin learned to recognize safe routes, remember the locations of fruit trees, and sense approaching predators long before they struck. They used their hands to pick, grasp, and perhaps even use simple tools like sticks or stones to dig or crack nuts. These small actions might seem insignificant, yet they were the quiet beginnings of human intelligence, the first glimmers of invention born from necessity. Their diet reflected their adaptability. While apes of the forests feasted on abundant fruit, Australopithecus had to survive on whatever the savanna offered: roots, seeds, insects, and occasionally scavenged meat from carcasses left behind by larger predators. This shift in diet was more than a matter of survival, it shaped their evolution. New nutrients fueled brain growth, setting the stage for the next leap in cognition. Australopithecus did not build tools like later humans, but their behavior hinted at the potential. Some scientists believe they used sharp stones naturally found on the ground to cut meat or scrape bark. Their hands were capable of precision, their eyes focused and calculating. They were beginning to think ahead, to plan not yet consciously as we do, but instinctively, guided by a growing awareness of cause and effect. Social life among these early hominins was deeply rooted in cooperation. Mothers carried their young for years, teaching them through imitation and repetition. Males and females likely worked together to gather food and watch for predators. Simple vocalizations, gestures, and expressions formed the first language of survival. In their calls and cries, the foundation of communication was born, the ancient rhythm that would one day become speech. Life for Lucy's kind was brief and perilous. Many died young from injuries, disease, or hunger. Yet, even in their fragility, they endured for nearly 2 million years. That alone speaks to their success. They were perfectly adapted to their environment, nimble climbers, tireless walkers, and ever-curious explorers of their world. When danger came, they could retreat to the trees. When food was scarce, they ventured further than ever before. Each step they took reshaped their anatomy, their posture, and their purpose. With walking came endurance, and with endurance came exploration. They could travel greater distances than their ancestors, following the herds and seeking new sources of water. This movement across the African landscape spread their genes, their habits, and their potential. And though Australopithecus would eventually vanish, their legacy would echo through time. Their bones became the foundation for the first humans to rise, times Homo habilis * the toolmaker. But before that chapter began, the age of Australopithecus marks something profound. The moment when instinct began to merge with reason. Lucy and her kind never knew the future they were shaping. They could not imagine art, fire, or the cities their descendants would one day build. Yet, in their simple acts of survival, they carried the silent spark of humanity's future. Millions of years later, when scientists uncovered Lucy's skeleton, the discovery sent ripples through human history. Her bones, frozen in stone, told the world that humanity's story was not sudden, it was slow, patient, and magnificent. Evolution was not a single event, but a long march of determination written into the very shape of our bodies. In Lucy's curved spine, we see the burden of survival in her small skull, the dawn of thought. And in her footprints, still preserved in ancient volcanic ash, we find a message across time, that the path to becoming human began with one simple act, repeated endlessly, one step forward, and then another. Around 4 million years ago, deep in the heart of Africa, a new kind of creature began to dominate the plains, times Australopithecus afarensis *, the ape who walked like a human. Among them was a female whose fossilized remains would one day be called Lucy, one of the most famous ancestors ever discovered. She stood barely over a meter tall, her body covered in hair, her arms long and powerful for climbing, yet her legs and pelvis told a different story. She walked upright, like us. Lucy and her kind lived in a world of danger, surrounded by predators like saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas. Yet somehow, these fragile beings thrived, walking confidently across the African savannas where no other ape dared to live. The upright walk that began with Sahelanthropus had now become natural. Australopithecus could travel long distances under the sun, carry food, and even care for their young while moving. Their hands, now free from walking, began to explore the world in new ways, grabbing, shaping, feeling, learning. They didn't yet make tools, but they were becoming aware of how the environment could be manipulated to their advantage. A stick could dig. A stone could crack open fruit. Each small act was a step toward intelligence. Their world was both paradise and battlefield. Waterholes were the center of life, attracting herds of antelope, elephants, and predators lurking in the tall grass. To survive, Australopithecus had to balance caution with courage. They were not hunters, they were opportunists. They scavenged leftovers from lion kills, foraged fruits, seeds, and roots, and relied heavily on the safety of their group. Unity was their strength. Traveling together meant protection, warmth, and the sharing of knowledge passed down through generations. Communication among them was primitive yet vital. They didn't have structured language, but they used gestures, expressions, and sounds, grunts, cries, and laughter to warn of danger or comfort one another. These simple interactions built emotional connections and laid the foundation for the language that would one day define our species. In their eyes, we see the first sparks of empathy and awareness, an understanding that life meant more when shared. Fossils reveal that Australopithecus had small brains, about 1/3 the size of ours. Yet within that limited space lay the earliest architecture of thought. They could solve problems, remember locations, and even plan ahead in small ways. Evolution was not rushing, it was sculpting. Over millions of years, it patiently refined bones, muscles, and neurons to create a creature capable of reasoning and imagination. As Africa's climate grew harsher, many species struggled to survive. Forests shrank further, and droughts became frequent. Australopithecus faced extinction more than once, yet their ability to adapt kept them alive. They moved between forests and open plains, climbing trees at night for safety, walking the ground by day for food. Each choice, each adaptation increased their odds of survival. For every Australopithecus that perished, another survived just long enough to pass its traits to the next generation. This is how evolution works, not in sudden leaps, but through the slow persistence of life that refuses to give up. Their survival instincts were sharp, but something deeper was evolving too: curiosity. They began to notice things others didn't, how a sharp rock could cut, or how a stick could reach food beyond their grasp. This growing awareness would soon define an entirely new kind of being. Scientists believe Australopithecus lived in small social groups, perhaps family-based, where mothers cared deeply for their young and males protected the group from predators. Within these early societies, emotions like attachment, jealousy, and playfulness began to emerge. They mourned their dead and formed bonds that went beyond survival. For the first time in Earth's history, compassion was evolving as a survival strategy. Their bodies were changing too. Walking upright made childbirth more difficult, forcing longer dependency between parent and child. This created stronger emotional bonds and cooperation, the first form of what would later become civilization. Through every birth, every loss, and every shared meal, they were building the social fabric that would one day hold humanity together. As centuries turned into millennia, the world continued to transform. New species of early humans would rise from the Australopithecus line, carrying fragments of their anatomy and behavior. One branch would lead to time's Homo habilis *, the toolmaker, and another to time's Homo erectus *, the first global explorer. But none of that could have happened without Lucy and her kind, the first beings to truly stand tall and look at the horizon with wonder. Today, when we walk, we echo their every step. The balance of our spine, the curve of our hips, the rhythm of our stride, all are gifts from Australopithecus. They may have vanished 2 million years ago, but their legacy remains etched into our very bones. They were not just a bridge between ape and human, they were proof that even the smallest spark of intelligence, courage, and cooperation could survive against impossible odds. And as the African sun set on their final generations, a new kind of creature began to emerge from their lineage. One who would look at a stone and see not just a rock, but a tool. The next chapter in our story was about to begin. Around 2.5 million years ago, a new figure appeared across the African plains, one that would mark the beginning of what we now call human. This was time's Homo habilis asterisk, known as the handyman, the first species to shape the world with its own hands. While their ancestors like Australopithecus had learned to survive through instinct and cooperation, Homo habilis times took the next step. They began to think. They lived in a dangerous, unpredictable world where survival depended on adaptation. The savannas of East Africa were teeming with life. Vast herds of antelope, towering elephants, and predators lurking at every shadow. The climate was shifting between dry and wet cycles, forcing every species to evolve or die. For time's Homo habilis asterisk, this chaos was not a curse, but a challenge, one that pushed their intelligence to grow. Their brains were nearly 50% larger than those of Australopithecus inside those skulls. Something extraordinary was happening. Neurons began to form more complex networks, allowing them to plan, remember, and imagine. With their growing minds and dexterous hands, they became the first true innovators of the human line. The proof lies in stone. The tools they made, crude but effective, they were simple flakes struck from river rocks, sharp enough to cut meat, scrape hides, and crack open bones for marrow. These were the first known tools in human history, part of what archaeologists call the Oldowan culture. Each tool represented a thought, a conscious decision to shape nature to serve their needs. It was more than survival, it was creation. With tools came new possibilities. Homo habilis times could now access meat left behind by predators using sharp stones to carve flesh from bones. This new source of protein fueled brain growth even further, strengthening the link between diet and intelligence. Every bite of meat, every moment spent thinking, shaped the course of evolution. They were not hunters yet, but scavengers following lions and hyenas, waiting for an opportunity. Danger surrounded them constantly, yet they thrived through caution and cooperation. Small groups of times, Homo habilis times, likely worked together, sharing food and teaching the young how to use tools. For the first time, knowledge was passed deliberately, generation to generation, a silent revolution of learning. Their lives were harsh and brief. The average lifespan may have been no more than 20 years, filled with struggle against predators, starvation, and disease. But even in such short lives, their impact was monumental. They were shaping the first spark of human culture, not art or language yet, but something deeper, shared memory. What one learned, others copied. What one discovered, others improved. This process of imitation and teaching became a foundation of humanity. Their communities were likely built around cooperation and trust. In a world where a single mistake meant death, survival depended on the group. Within these small families, emotions deepened, not just fear or instinct, but care, loyalty, and even grief. Fossils suggest they sometimes protected their injured and elderly, showing the earliest forms of compassion that still define us today. The landscape they walked was wild and primal. Volcanic plains stretched across Kenya and Tanzania, dotted with lakes and ancient trees. Here, in places like Olduvai Gorge, the story of time's Homo habilis times is written in stone and bone. Scattered remains show how they lived, ate, and worked together. Fragments of skulls, hand bones worn smooth from gripping tools, and sharp flakes lying beside animal bones scarred by their first cuts. And perhaps, as they gathered around carcasses or huddled beneath trees during storms, something new stirred within them awareness. They began to recognize patterns, the way rivers carve the land, the cycles of rain and drought, the migration of animals. They started to see cause and effect, linking action to outcome. From this came foresight, the seed of intelligence that would eventually bloom into science, art, and philosophy. Homo habilis times lived in a time of change. From their line would rise other species, some smaller, some stronger, some smarter. Evolution was branching, experimenting. But their role was clear. They were the architects of progress, the ones who turned survival into innovation. They were the hands that shaped the future. Their tools may have been simple stones, but in their simplicity lay the origin of everything that defines us. Every skyscraper, every spacecraft, every work of art can trace its ancestry to that first moment when one of them picked up a rock, struck it, and realized for the first time in Earth's history that the world could be changed by thought. And so, under the African sun, amid the dust and roar of predators, Homo habilis times began to transform the planet with nothing more than curiosity, courage, and a handful of stones. Their time on Earth would be brief, yet their legacy eternal, for they were the first to look at the world not as it was, but as it could be. Around 1.8 million years ago, a new species rose from the shadows of Africa and took humanity's next great step forward. This was time's Homo erectus, times the upright man. Taller, stronger, and smarter than any of their ancestors, they were the first beings who didn't just survive the Earth, they began to explore it. Their appearance marked a turning point in evolution when instinct gave way to intelligence and fear began to transform into curiosity. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus times would dominate the planet. They were the first humans to leave Africa, venturing into Asia and Europe, spreading across deserts, forests, and mountains. From Indonesia to Georgia, their fossils have been found scattered across continents, proof of the first global travelers in human history. No other species had ever adapted to such a range of climates and landscapes. They weren't merely surviving in the world, they were learning to master it. Their bodies were built for endurance. Long legs, narrow hips, and muscular frames made them the first long-distance walkers and runners. While other animals could sprint faster, Homo erectus times could outlast them. This ability allowed them to follow herds for miles under the scorching African sun, patiently wearing down prey through persistence. This technique, known as endurance hunting, required not just strength, but planning and understanding of time, movement, and teamwork. But the true revolution came not from their muscles, but from their minds. Homo erectus times developed more advanced tools than times Homo habilis *. Their hand axes, sharp, symmetrical, and beautifully crafted, were unlike anything that came before. These tools weren't random, they were designed with precision and purpose. To shape stone in such a consistent way meant they could imagine an end result before it existed. It was the birth of abstract thinking, the ability to visualize the future. And with that leap came another miracle, fire. Though it remains debated when exactly Homo erectus times first controlled it, evidence from places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa shows traces of burnt bones and ash nearly 1 million years old. Whether sparked by lightning or friction, fire changed everything. It offered light in the darkness, protection from predators, and warmth in the cold. It transformed raw meat into nourishment and expanded the human diet. Around the flicker of those early flames, humanity's first communities were born. For the first time, night was no longer an enemy. Fire extended the day, creating moments of rest and reflection. Around the glowing embers, they likely shared food, taught the young, and communicated in simple sounds and gestures. These firesides were the birthplaces of language, culture, and social bonds. Within the light of those flames, the human mind began to imagine stories, perhaps even the first sparks of spirituality. Their faces were recognizably human now. Broad noses, heavy brows, but eyes that reflected awareness. Their brains had grown larger, capable of planning hunts, building shelters, and understanding complex group cooperation. In their expressions, we can almost glimpse thought, a quiet intelligence, observing, learning, and remembering. As they spread across continents, they adapted to new environments. In Asia, they hunted elephants and rhinoceroses. In Europe, they faced the chill of ice ages. Some groups learned to fashion simple clothing from animal skins, while others used caves as shelter. Their tools evolved with their surroundings more refined, more specialized, showing that times, Homo erectus times, wasn't merely reacting to nature, they were shaping it. Their mastery of fire also unlocked deeper changes. Cooked food was easier to chew and digest, freeing energy once spent on digestion and fueling brain expansion. Their jaws grew smaller, their teeth finer, and their skulls larger. Each generation became slightly more intelligent, more adaptable, more aware. It was a cycle of evolution feeding on knowledge, and knowledge feeding on evolution. Fossil evidence shows they cared for their weak and elderly, another step toward compassion. When an injured individual survived, it meant others had shared food, offered protection, or waited while they healed. In these quiet acts of empathy lay the foundation of morality, the early pulse of what would one day become human conscience. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus times flourished longer than any human species before or since. They built the first true cultures, spreading across continents and adapting to endless challenges. When they looked at the horizon, perhaps they saw not just land and sky, but possibility. They had no idea they were setting the stage for all that would follow, for Neanderthals, for sapiens, for civilization itself. When the last of times, Homo erectus times, vanished, the world they left behind was forever changed. They were the first travelers, the first firekeepers, the first to look at the stars and wonder. They carried the torch of evolution further than any before them, and from their flame, humanity's story continued to burn brighter. In their ashes and tools, in the footprints scattered across ancient plains and forgotten caves, lies the memory of a species that dared to rise, explore, and endure. They were the upright ones, and through them, the world learned what it meant to be human. Around 1 million years ago, the world began to freeze. Towering sheets of ice crept slowly across continents, swallowing forests and mountains beneath their cold, unrelenting weight. This was the age of ice, an era that tested every living creature, reshaping the planet and forcing evolution into overdrive. For early humans, like Homo erectus times and their descendants, it was not just a fight for survival, it was the crucible that forged resilience, intelligence, and the will to endure. The temperature of the planet dropped drastically. Vast herds of woolly mammoths, bison, and giant deer roamed the tundra, while saber-toothed cats and enormous bears hunted among the snow. Humans were no longer living in the warm plains of Africa, they had spread into Europe and Asia, where winters could kill in hours. Survival here required more than instinct. It demanded adaptation, cooperation, and invention. Fire, once a luxury, became a lifeline. The flickering flame that times Homo erectus times had learned to control now meant life or death. Around their fires, they cooked meat, warmed their hands, and guarded themselves from predators lurking in the dark. Fire changed their nights into moments of unity. They shared food, repaired tools, and perhaps even told simple stories, gestures, and sounds, forming the earliest roots of language. Stone tools evolved rapidly during this time. The hand axe, perfected by time's Homo erectus *, became sharper and more symmetrical. Some learned to craft specialized tools for scraping hides or cutting meat, evidence of planning and foresight. These weren't random acts of survival, they were signs of growing intellect. Early humans were beginning to see patterns in the world around them and act with purpose. Their diets also changed. As plants became scarce in the cold, they relied more heavily on meat. Hunting replaced scavenging. This shift required teamwork, organized drives to corner prey, strategies to coordinate attacks, and communication to share success. Each hunt was not only a battle against animals, but against the elements themselves. Every successful hunt meant another day of life for the group. To survive the freezing winds, early humans began to create shelters. They used branches, bones, and animal hides to build windbreaks and huts, marking the first attempts to manipulate their environment. They learned to wear animal skins for warmth, sewing them together with bone needles and plant fibers. These were small acts of defiance against nature's fury, and each one brought them closer to mastery over the world. The Ice Age also shaped their minds in unexpected ways. Isolation during long winters forced groups to stay close together, deepening bonds and cooperation. Communication became essential, and through this, language began to evolve further. Sounds became symbols. Symbols became meaning. It was here, in the frozen silence of ancient winters, that humanity's first true voice began to form. As generations passed, some populations evolved into new species. Homo heidelbergensis times emerged taller, broader, and smarter than their ancestors. They built more advanced tools, hunted in coordinated groups, and began to understand death in a way no creature ever had. Burial sites suggest they may have started to care for their dead, placing bodies carefully, as if honoring them. This was the birth of emotion beyond instinct, the first sign of spiritual thought. The harsh conditions of the Ice Age also triggered one of evolution's greatest experiments. Isolated by glaciers and distance, different human populations began to diverge. In Africa, one branch continued to evolve toward time's Homo Sapiens *, while in Europe, another would become time's Homo neanderthalensis times the Neanderthals. The frozen world was creating new kinds of humans, each perfectly adapted to their own realm. For time's Homo erectus times and their descendants, the challenges never ceased. They learned to navigate seasons, follow animal migrations, and store food. They developed memory, anticipation, and patience abilities that would become cornerstones of human intelligence. They were no longer just reacting to the world, they were predicting it. Under the pale light of an Ice Age moon, a small group of early humans might have huddled together for warmth, watching the fire dance in their eyes. They didn't know it, but they were creating culture bonds, not built from necessity alone, but from connection. As snow fell quietly outside their shelter, something within them was awakening imagination, empathy, and a sense of belonging that would echo through time. These were the Ice Age hunters, survivors of a world that tested the very limits of life. They stood at the edge of extinction and learned to endure through intelligence, unity, and invention. From their frozen world, the foundations of humanity's greatest strengths were born. The fire that flickered in their caves was more than warmth. It was a symbol of something eternal. It was the light of thought, of perseverance, of hope, a flame that would never again be extinguished, carried through the ages by every human that followed. Around 400,000 years ago, the wind across Europe carried the scent of pine forests and snow. Deep within caves and mountain valleys, a new kind of human emerged, the Neanderthals. They were powerful, broad-shouldered, and built for the cold. With their muscular frames and thick bones, they could endure icy winters that would kill most creatures within days. Yet, behind their heavy brows and rugged faces, their eyes held something unmistakably human: awareness, intelligence, and emotion. The Neanderthals were not our ancestors, but our cousins, another branch of humanity shaped by a different world. While Homo Sapiens times, were still evolving in Africa, the Neanderthals had already mastered survival in the frozen plains of Europe and Western Asia. They were hunters, toolmakers, and caretakers. And for over 200,000 years, they thrived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Their tools were refined, complex, and efficient. Using flint and bone, they crafted spears, scrapers, and knives that rivaled the technology of early times Homo sapiens **. They hunted massive beasts, mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses using strategy and cooperation. Each hunt was planned, each movement coordinated. This was not instinct alone. It was intelligence, sharpened by experience and passed down through generations. Inside their caves, the fire burned bright. They built hearths, organized living spaces, and prepared food with care. Bones and ash found in archaeological sites show that they controlled fire just as skillfully as we did. Around these fires, they shared warmth, food, and stories told through gestures and sounds. Their communication was complex. They may have had the ability for speech, their throats and brains capable of forming words, though we will never hear their voices. But the most striking discovery about Neanderthals is not their strength or their tools, it is their humanity. They cared for their injured, helped the weak, and buried their dead. Fossils show that individuals who suffered severe injuries or illnesses lived for years under the care of their group. One famous skeleton from Shanidar Cave in Iraq belonged to a man who had lost an arm and was nearly blind, yet survived for decades, proof that his people fed and protected him. This was empathy, compassion, emotions once thought to belong only to us. In their burial sites, scientists have found traces of flowers, pigments, and personal items placed beside the dead. These gestures reveal something profound, the birth of belief. They may have understood death not as an ending, but as a transformation. In the silent glow of their cave fires, they might have looked at the stars and wondered where their loved ones had gone. Their lives were deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. They followed the migrations of herds, knew the cycle of seasons, and read the world through observation. They made necklaces from shells and animal teeth, painted with red ochre, and wore feathers, signs of symbolic thought. This creativity hints that Neanderthals experienced beauty, pride, and identity. They were artists of survival, and perhaps of emotion. For thousands of years, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens times coexisted. When modern humans began to spread from Africa into Europe, they encountered their cousins face to face. At first, they may have competed for land, for food, for shelter. But soon, something unexpected happened. They interbred. Traces of Neanderthal DNA still live within us today, carried in our blood and bones. They are part of who we are. Their story continues through our cells. Despite their intelligence and adaptability, the Neanderthals eventually began to fade. Changing climates, competition with times, Homo sapiens asterisk, and dwindling populations led to their slow disappearance around 40,000 years ago. Yet they did not vanish completely. Every human alive outside of Africa carries a small fragment of Neanderthal ancestry, a reminder that we were never truly alone. Their extinction was not the end of their story, but a merging of two worlds. When we look at a fire's glow, craft tools, or mourn our dead, we echo the Neanderthal's spirit. Their strength lives within our muscles, their empathy within our hearts, their curiosity within our minds. For 200 millennia, they ruled the ice and snow. They adapted to every challenge the planet threw at them and lived with courage and tenderness. And though they are gone, their legacy whispers through time a quiet truth that humanity was never a single spark, but a collection of flames burning together in the dark. In the remote highlands of Siberia, within the cold darkness of a cave known as Denisova, a small bone fragment was discovered no larger than a fingertip. Yet hidden within it lay the DNA of a completely unknown human species. They were called the Denisovans, a mysterious branch of humanity that lived and vanished without leaving behind cities, tools, or art for us to find. Their story is written not in fossils, but in our genes. The Denisovans lived around the same time as Neanderthals, somewhere between 300,000 and 30,000 years ago. While the Neanderthals dominated Europe and the Middle East, the Denisovans roamed across Asia from the cold mountains of Siberia to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. They were explorers of their own kind, adapting to every extreme the Earth could offer. We know little about how they looked, yet DNA evidence paints a partial picture. They were likely strong, with broad skulls and faces adapted to high-altitude living. Their genes helped modern Tibetans survive with low oxygen in the Himalayas, a gift from their ancient ancestors. Through interbreeding, they passed fragments of their strength into us, long after their bones turned to dust. But the Denisovans were not alone. Scattered across islands and mountains, other forgotten humans lived parallel lives. On the Indonesian island of Flores, a small species known as times Homo floresiensis, times nicknamed the Hobbit, stood barely 3 feet tall. They crafted tools, hunted small animals, and lived in caves surrounded by towering volcanoes. Thousands of miles away, in the Philippines, another tiny human called times Homo luzonensis times walked the forests, leaving behind teeth and bones so unique that scientists still puzzle over their origin. Each of these species, the Denisovans, the Hobbits, and the Luzonensis, were living experiments of evolution, shaped by isolation. They adapted in remarkable ways. Their small bodies and limited resources forced intelligence to grow in different directions. They were proof that nature was not aiming for one version of humanity, but many, each equally capable of survival. In their world, there was no single human story. The planet was home to multiple human species, coexisting and occasionally meeting, trading, fighting, and perhaps even sharing knowledge. Imagine a world where different kinds of humans walked the Earth together. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, Hobbits in Indonesia, and times Homo Sapiens times emerging from Africa. For hundreds of thousands of years, we were not alone. When times Homo Sapiens times began their great migration out of Africa, they encountered these distant cousins. In caves and valleys, under starlit skies, they met not as monsters or enemies, but as kin. They shared tools, exchanged genes, and left traces of one another within their descendants. Interbreeding was not an accident, it was part of survival. And because of it, the DNA of these ancient species still lives within us, an echo of ancient diversity. Though the Denisovans left behind little trace of their culture, what remains suggests they were intelligent, adaptable, and deeply connected to their environment. Their tools found in the cave at Denisova show skill and care, and their jewelry, a carefully polished green stone bracelet, suggests a sense of beauty and craftsmanship that rivals modern humans. This fragment of art, created tens of thousands of years ago, may have gleamed once on a wrist beneath the northern lights, a silent symbol of consciousness shining in the darkness. Slowly, over tens of thousands of years, these other human species began to vanish. Isolation, climate change, and competition with times, Homo sapiens times, led to their extinction. One by one, they disappeared. The hobbits of Flores, the Luzon humans, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, leaving only us. But even as they faded from the earth, their legacy merged with ours, ensuring that no human line truly ended. Today, when we look into a mirror, we are not seeing a pure species. We are a mosaic, part sapiens, part Neanderthal, part Denisovan. Their strength flows through our blood, their instincts shape our resilience, and their creativity lives in our imagination. Humanity is not a single branch on the tree of life, but the final bloom of many intertwined roots. The Denisovans may never have known the world they helped create. Their bones are gone, their faces forgotten, their voices silent. Yet their story endures, whispered in our DNA, pulsing quietly in our veins. We are their legacy, their final echo across time. And in that echo lies the truth of evolution, that we are not just descendants of one species, but the children of many, the last survivors of a family that once filled the earth. Around 300,000 years ago, in the heart of Africa, a new being emerged, one that looked, thought, and felt closer to us than any that came before. They were time's Homo Sapiens *, the wise human. From their first breath, they were different. Their bodies were lighter, their faces smaller, and their minds more powerful than any the world had ever seen. This was the birth of modern intelligence, the dawn of imagination, and the moment the Earth would never be the same again. They were born into a land of change. Africa's climate was unpredictable. Floods, droughts, and shifting landscapes shaped every life that walked the plains. Survival here required flexibility and foresight. And times, Homo sapiens times, had both. They watched, remembered, and learned. Their brains were not just larger, they were wired for creativity. Inside their skulls, 86 billion neurons fired in patterns capable of language, art, and abstract thought. For the first time in the history of life, the universe had created a creature that could understand itself. They crafted tools with precision blades thinner, sharper, and more efficient than anything their ancestors had made. They hunted with strategy, using traps and cooperation. And when they looked at the world around them, they didn't just see danger or opportunity, they saw meaning. They began to imagine, to dream, to wonder, to ask questions about life and death. This was the beginning of what scientists call the cognitive revolution. It was not just about intelligence, but awareness. Homo sapiens times could visualize things that didn't yet exist. They could plan for tomorrow, tell stories about the past, and believe in forces they couldn't see. Imagination became their most powerful weapon, one that no other creature could match. Through this newfound creativity came language. It began with simple sounds and gestures, but soon evolved into something astonishing: the ability to share complex thoughts, to warn, to teach, to dream aloud. With language, knowledge could be passed down not just by imitation, but by storytelling. One generation could now teach the next about hunting grounds, seasons, and dangers far beyond their sight. These early humans also began to express themselves in ways that went beyond survival. Deep within caves, they painted animals in motion: horses, bison, mammoths, using pigments made from crushed minerals. Their hands left prints on the walls, frozen in time, as if declaring times we were here. Asterisk, these paintings were not merely decoration. They were symbols, stories, perhaps prayers. The mind of times, Homo sapiens times, had entered the realm of art and spirituality. They also shaped ornaments, beads from shells, pendants from bones, symbols of identity and belonging. This was the birth of culture. Humans began to form tribes, defined not just by blood, but by shared belief. They danced, sang, and performed rituals that gave meaning to life and death. They buried their dead with care, leaving gifts and tools beside them, believing that something waited beyond. In these acts, we see the first glimpse of the human soul. Their adaptability was unmatched. While other species struggled to survive in narrow habitats, Homo sapiens times learned to conquer deserts, forests, and coastlines alike. They built rafts to cross rivers and perhaps even seas. They crafted clothing from furs, shelters from wood and bone, and weapons from stone and fire. Every challenge they faced became a lesson. Every obstacle, a new invention. As their numbers grew, they began to spread. Small bands left Africa, following the rhythm of the seasons, chasing herds and searching for new lands. They did not know it, but they were beginning a journey that would take them across the entire planet. Their migration would bring them face to face with other human species, the Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovans in Asia, and with each encounter, they would learn, trade, and sometimes merge. But wherever they went, one thing remained constant: their capacity to imagine. This imagination allowed them to invent myths, create symbols, and build cooperation on a scale no other creature could. They began to believe in shared ideas: spirits, ancestors, gods, and destinies. These beliefs bound them together, forming societies that could work toward common goals. Language and imagination turned survival into civilization. Fossil records show that even in their earliest days, Homo sapiens were innovators. They developed fishing hooks, tailored clothing, and musical instruments like flutes carved from bone. They learned to use pigments not only for art, but for communication, marking territory, identifying clans, and perhaps expressing emotion. This was not just survival, it was the beginning of self-expression. The world was still wild, filled with predators and peril, but humans had become something new architects of their own fate. They no longer relied solely on instinct. They relied on creativity, collaboration, and reason. Their minds were now the most powerful tools on Earth. As night fell over Africa's ancient plains, a small group of Homo sapiens times, sat beneath the stars, watching sparks rise from their fire. Perhaps one of them wondered what those lights in the sky were: distant fires, maybe souls of the dead, or something more. That question was the first step toward everything that would come: religion, philosophy, science, and art. From that moment on, humanity was no longer just another animal. They were dreamers, builders, storytellers. The Earth had birthed something that could imagine the future, remember the past, and ask why. And in that single, quiet realization, the world changed forever. Around 70,000 years ago, the children of Africa began to move not just across their homeland, but far beyond it. Small bands of Homo sapiens *, carrying little more than stone tools, fire, and dreams, set out on foot into the unknown. They crossed deserts, followed rivers, and braved vast coastlines driven by curiosity and survival. This journey, known as the Great Migration, would transform them into the most widespread and adaptable species the planet had ever seen. It began slowly, with just a few hundred humans leaving Africa's eastern plains. They followed herds of animals through the Red Sea coasts and into the Arabian Peninsula. From there, their descendants spread across Asia, Europe, and eventually the entire world. Generation by generation, they walked through jungles, over mountains, and across frozen tundra. They had no maps, no plans, only instinct and imagination. But in their footsteps lay the beginning of global humanity. As they spread, Homo Sapiens times met their cousins the Neanderthals in Europe and the Denisovans in Asia. These encounters were not just clashes, they were unions. They exchanged tools, ideas, and, at times, blood. Through interbreeding, fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA entered our lineage, giving us traits that helped us survive cold, hunger, and disease. Our genes became a living archive of ancient encounters, proof that humanity's story was written together, not alone. Each new land brought its own trials. In the snowy fields of Europe, early humans hunted mammoths and reindeer, building shelters from their bones and hides. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, they faced venomous snakes and monsoons. In Australia, they learned to hunt giant marsupials, crossing open seas to reach distant islands, a feat no other species had accomplished. And when they finally reached the icy edges of Siberia, they built the knowledge that would one day carry their descendants into the Americas. These migrations were more than physical journeys, they were journeys of the mind. Every new landscape forced adaptation, invention, and cooperation. Groups that once lived apart began to form tribes. Tribes became networks, and networks became societies. Language evolved rapidly to coordinate hunts, share stories, and pass down lessons. Through words, they built invisible bonds stronger than any weapon. They also carried something else: belief. Wherever they went, humans imagined invisible worlds, spirits in the trees, gods in the thunder, ancestors in the stars. These shared myths united people who had never met, creating a sense of belonging larger than the tribe. Belief gave them purpose, and purpose gave them courage. With imagination, they turned fear into ritual and death into meaning. By 50,000 years ago, the earth itself began to bear the mark of their presence. They painted walls deep inside caves, places like Chauvet in France and Sulawesi in Indonesia, where animals danced in flickering firelight, brought to life by pigment and shadow. They crafted beads, carved figurines, and shaped tools, not just for use, but for beauty. These acts were more than art, they were declarations of identity. Humanity was now expressing its inner world. Music, too, began to echo through valleys and plains. Flutes carved from bone played melodies beneath the stars. Drums made from animal hides carried rhythm into the night. For the first time, emotion was shared through sound. Through song, humans found a new form of connection, something no other creature had ever created. As their populations grew, they began to alter ecosystems. Fire was no longer just warmth, it became a tool to shape the environment. They burned grasslands to drive herds, cleared forests to build shelters, and reshaped rivers to catch fish. Humanity was now not only part of nature, but a force that could transform it. In their travels, they carried with them stories, oral maps that guided generations. One tale might describe a distant mountain, another a hidden river where herds gathered each season. These stories were survival manuals, disguised as myth. Memory became their greatest technology, allowing knowledge to outlive the body. Yet, their expansion was not without cost. Wherever Homo sapiens times went, other species disappeared. Not just animals, but humans too. The Neanderthals faded from Europe, the Denisovans vanished from Asia, and the hobbits of Flores disappeared into legend. By 40,000 years ago, we were alone, the last survivors of a once crowded family tree. And so, under the vast sky, Homo sapiens times became the dominant species not by strength, but by imagination, cooperation, and adaptability. They had crossed continents, mastered fire, shaped tools, and painted their dreams upon stone. They were no longer bound to one land or one way of life. The earth was now their home. As night fell over new horizons, the forests of Europe, the deserts of Arabia, the coasts of Asia, fires glowed in distant camps. Humans looked to the stars and began to wonder about their place in the universe. In those moments of quiet reflection, something eternal was born. The desire to understand not just how to survive, but why we exist. The Great Migration was more than a journey of bodies across land. It was the awakening of the human spirit. From that point onward, the world belonged to the dreamers, and humanity would never stop walking. Around 40,000 years ago, the world stood at the edge of a new age. An age not defined by muscle or fire, but by imagination. Homo sapiens *. The last surviving branch of humanity had now spread across every continent except Antarctica. They had faced ice, drought, predators, and isolation. Yet something within them had changed their minds. Now sharpened by survival and wonder, began to create not just tools but meaning. The era that followed became the birth of human culture. Art, music, language, and belief flourished across the planet, turning survival into civilization's first whispers. Deep within dark caves, humans painted their world in color and light. On walls untouched by sun for tens of thousands of years, they drew bison, mammoths, horses, and the hands of their own kind. Each stroke was deliberate, filled with memory, myth, and reverence. They weren't just recording the world, they were interpreting it. In Europe, the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet revealed animals that seemed to move when illuminated by firelight, ancient cinema carved into stone. In Indonesia, the oldest hand stencils appeared, red silhouettes reaching out from the past, as if humanity itself was trying to touch eternity. These paintings were more than art. They were communication, prayers, or perhaps declarations of existence. We are here, we remember, we dream. As their minds expanded, humans began to see patterns in nature, the rhythm of the seasons, the phases of the moon, the migration of animals. They learned to track time, to plan harvests, and to predict the future. Imagination became foresight, and foresight became power. Language grew richer, no longer limited to warnings or commands. Now it carried stories, tales of heroes, ancestors, gods, and spirits. These stories gave people identity and purpose, connecting tribes across generations. Myths became invisible threads that bound entire communities together. For the first time, large groups of humans could cooperate not through blood ties, but through shared belief. This was the true revolution, the invention of the shared imagination, the ability to unite thousands of strangers under a single idea. It was this power that would one day build kingdoms, religions, and nations. But even before those civilizations rose, humans were already shaping the planet. They crafted delicate jewelry from shells, carved statues from ivory, and invented music that echoed through caves. One of the oldest instruments ever found, a flute made from the wing bone of a vulture, still carries the sound of that ancient world. Imagine a group of humans sitting beneath a starlit sky, the melody of bone flutes and beating drums rising into the night, their songs blending with the crackle of fire. For the first time in the history of life, the earth was filled with music. As their creativity blossomed, so did their spirituality. Humans began to see themselves as part of something larger, a connection between life, death, and the unknown. They buried their dead with care, placing tools, ornaments, and food beside the bodies. This was not just ritual, it was belief in an afterlife. The human mind had begun to imagine eternity. And as imagination expanded, so did ambition. Humans began to build more complex shelters, organize communities, and form trade networks that stretched over hundreds of miles. They exchanged obsidian, shells, pigments, and stories, the first form of global connection. Wherever they went, they carried with them not just survival, but culture. Yet beneath all this progress, the wild world around them was changing. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and the Great Ice Age began to retreat. New forests spread across the earth, and animals like mammoths and saber-toothed cats began to vanish. For times, Homo Sapiens *, this was not an ending, but a beginning. They learned to adapt once more to fish, to farm, to settle. In this time of change, humanity's greatest weapon was not the spear, but the mind. They could imagine what did not yet exist: villages, gods, futures. The same creativity that painted caves now built communities. They began to tame fire not just for warmth, but for shaping clay and metal. Each spark of invention carried them closer to civilization. The world was no longer just a wilderness to survive in, it had become a canvas to shape. Humans were rewriting nature itself, bending rivers, cultivating land, and building homes that stood for generations. And yet, even as they changed the world, the memory of the old ways endured. They still sang to the stars, still whispered to the spirits, still dreamed of the hunt and the flame. In every heart burned the same ancient fire that had once glowed in the caves of their ancestors. By the end of this age, the transformation was complete. Homo sapiens times, once one species among many, now stood alone. They were artists, storytellers, inventors, and dreamers. They had turned fear into faith, survival into purpose, and existence into meaning. The age of imagination had begun, and with it, the story of everything that would follow. Around 15,000 years ago, as the last great ice sheets began to retreat, the Earth was reborn. Rivers once frozen started to flow again, forests spread across the continents, and the climate softened. The world that had shaped humanity's struggle for hundreds of thousands of years was transforming, and Homo sapiens times, were transforming with it. For the first time, survival was not just about enduring nature, it was about shaping it. This moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, the Age of Settlement. For countless generations, humans had lived as nomads, hunters, gatherers, and wanderers, moving with the seasons and the herds. They knew the land better than any map could describe. Every valley, river, and tree was part of their memory. But now, something changed. As the planet warmed, plants grew more abundant. Grains like barley and wheat began to thrive in fertile valleys, and humans noticed that when seeds fell to the ground, they sprouted again. This simple observation would ignite one of the greatest revolutions in history: agriculture. The first seeds were planted not in cities or farms, but in curiosity. People began to stay longer near fertile rivers like the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Indus. They built temporary camps, which slowly turned into permanent villages. These early settlements, small clusters of huts made from mud and straw, were the birthplaces of civilization. Food could now be grown, not just found. This meant people no longer needed to move constantly in search of sustenance. For the first time, they could plan for the future. They stored grain, tamed animals, and began to control the rhythm of their own existence. Humans had learned to command life itself. The domestication of nature had begun. This new relationship with the land changed everything. When food was abundant, populations grew. Children no longer had to be carried on long migrations, and families expanded. Surplus food meant time to think, create, and invent. Pottery, weaving, and early forms of trade emerged. Art moved from cave walls to the tools and objects of daily life. But with settlement came complexity. Ownership appeared. Land, crops, and animals were now possessions. For the first time, humans began to define what was theirs. Cooperation evolved into community, but also into hierarchy. Some became leaders, others followers. Inequality, born from abundance, became a part of the human story. As generations passed, these early villages grew larger, connecting through trade routes and shared beliefs. They built shrines and temples, offering thanks to the earth and sky for their harvests. Religion deepened, now tied not just to spirits of nature, but to gods of fertility, rain, and sun. These deities reflected humanity's new power and new dependence on the land. Technology, too, advanced rapidly. The bow and arrow revolutionized hunting and defense. The plow transformed farming. Fire, once used for warmth, was now harnessed to shape clay, harden bricks, and eventually smelt metal. With each innovation, humans pushed further away from their primitive past and closer to civilization. But not everyone settled. Across the continents, some tribes continue the old ways. Hunters and gatherers roaming the earth as their ancestors had. They carried with them the ancient memory of freedom, movement, and harmony with nature. These nomads would coexist with farmers for thousands of years, trading goods and knowledge, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with conflict. The world was becoming connected. People traveled across great distances, exchanging obsidian, shells, and stories. Knowledge flowed like rivers between cultures, carrying ideas that would one day shape nations. Humans were no longer just surviving within nature, they were shaping ecosystems, redirecting rivers, and changing the climate around them. The age of human influence, the Anthropocene, had begun. And yet, beneath the progress, something ancient still pulsed under the starlit sky. Around flickering fires, humans still sang songs of the hunt, of spirits, and of the mysteries of life. Even as they built walls and villages, they looked to the heavens and wondered if something greater watched over them. As the first towns rose from the soil and the first seeds sprouted into fields, humanity stood on the threshold of civilization. They had conquered hunger, tamed fire, and begun to shape the land. But they had also opened new questions about ownership, power, and purpose. In the soil beneath their feet lay both creation and consequence. They had learned to command the earth, but not yet themselves. Still, the journey continued. From this point forward, humanity would no longer just adapt to the world would adapt to them. And so, from the whispers of wind in ancient grasslands to the sound of tools shaping stone, a new era dawned, the age of civilization's first breath. Around 10,000 years ago, the first sparks of civilization began to glow across the planet. Scattered villages that once dotted riverbanks and fertile plains grew into the earliest human settlements. Fields of wheat and barley stretched where wild grass once swayed, and smoke from cooking fires rose into morning skies that had witnessed only wilderness for millions of years. The world was changing, and humanity had become its architect. The great rivers became cradles of progress. Along the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, and the Yellow River, humans built the first organized societies. These waterways were lifelines giving water to crops, fish to catch, and routes to travel. Near their banks, families built homes from mud and reed, while fields shimmered with golden harvests. For the first time in history, humans were not just surviving with nature, they were mastering it. With steady food came population, and with population came community. Hundreds grew into thousands. The first towns emerged: Jericho in the Levant, Catalhoyuk in Anatolia, and other settlements scattered across Mesopotamia and Egypt. People built walls for defense, markets for trade, and shrines for worship. Each sunrise brought more hands to work the soil, build homes, and craft tools. Humanity had taken root. And with stability came imagination. Freed from the constant chase for food, humans turned inward toward art, structure, and meaning. They began to carve symbols, mark time, and record ideas. From the rhythmic grooves on clay tablets emerged the earliest forms of writing. It began as simple tallies, grain counts, livestock records, but soon evolved into language etched in stone. These marks would become the foundation of memory, the birth of history itself. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, people learned to shape cities. Uruk, Ur, and Eridu rose from the plains, sprawling settlements with streets, temples, and marketplaces. Towering ziggurats reached for the heavens, symbols of both devotion and power. Priests and kings claimed divine authority, ruling with knowledge and myth intertwined. It was here, in these ancient cities, that humanity first began to define civilization. But civilization brought both creation and consequence. Food surpluses gave rise to wealth, and wealth gave rise to inequality. Rulers emerged, followed by soldiers, scribes, and slaves. The simplicity of the tribal world faded into hierarchy. Laws were born to control what nature once governed freely. Written codes, like those that would later appear in Babylon, replaced instinct with order. Humanity was organizing itself, but also dividing itself. Across the continents, similar transformations unfolded in Egypt. Along the gentle curve of the Nile, small farming villages evolved into the world's first kingdoms. People built massive tombs and temples, aligning them with stars and seasons. They believed in gods who controlled the floods and judged the souls of the dead. Death itself became a journey, not an ending, but a passage. Religion and science were not separate. They were one and the same, guiding humanity's curiosity about existence. To the east, in the valleys of the Indus and the Yellow River, humans developed systems of trade, irrigation, and architecture that rivaled anything in the West. They measured time by the sun and moon, mapped stars, and built cities with planned streets and drainage centuries ahead of their time. As civilizations grew, so did human ambition. Trade routes stretched for thousands of miles, connecting lands and people who would never meet. Obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from Egypt, spices from Asia. The first global network of exchange began to pulse across the ancient world. Along with goods, came ideas, stories, music, language, and belief. Art flourished once more. Stone gave way to bronze, and craftsmanship evolved into culture. Sculptors carved gods and rulers. Potters painted scenes of daily life. Musicians played harps and flutes in palaces of mud and light. Beauty became a language of its own, a reflection of humanity's growing consciousness. But beneath this progress, the same questions lingered: who are we, why are we here, and what lies beyond? Humans could now command rivers, build monuments, and shape metal, but the mystery of life itself remained untouched. The same curiosity that had driven their ancestors to paint caves now drove them to build temples that touched the heavens. And still, as civilizations rose, so did their shadows. War appeared, organized, intentional, and devastating. Humans learned not only to create together, but to destroy together. Villages turned into fortresses, cities into empires. The same intelligence that built harmony could now orchestrate conquest. The balance between creation and destruction had begun a pattern that would echo through all of human history. Yet, despite the wars, the plagues, and the floods, humanity continued to grow. Curiosity, imagination, and resilience kept them moving forward. By the end of this age, humans had achieved what no other species ever had: the ability to change the course of the planet itself. They could bend rivers, raise monuments, and write their own destiny. The earth no longer shaped them, they shaped the earth. And with that, the world of early humans, the age of wanderers, hunters, and gatherers, had finally given birth to civilization. The story of evolution had reached its next great chapter, the age of humanity. Around 5,000 years ago, the scattered seeds of early civilization began to bloom into the first great societies, vast organized worlds built by human hands and imagination. The simple farming villages that once hugged riverbanks had now grown into cities of stone, bronze, and belief. The age of early civilization had dawned, and with it came writing, kings, empires, and gods. The first great cities rose in Mesopotamia, Uruk, Lagash, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved life into the desert. The land between these rivers became the world's first empire of innovation. Here, humans built monumental temples called ziggurats that reached toward the sky, believing they were stairways between earth and heaven. Beneath them, scribes pressed cuneiform symbols into wet clay, the earliest written words in human history. Through these symbols, memory became immortal. Ideas could now outlive those who spoke them. Civilization had given birth to history. As city walls grew taller and trade routes stretched wider, societies became more complex. Food surpluses turned into wealth. Wealth turned into class. At the top stood kings and priests, claiming authority from the gods. They organized labor, built irrigation canals, and created the first laws. In ancient Sumer, King Urukagina wrote decrees to protect the poor, the earliest traces of social justice. Later, the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon would set punishments for crimes, inscribed on stone so all could see. Humanity was learning to govern itself through rules, not instincts. But with order came ambition. Kings began to crave not just survival, but legacy. War became the shadow twin of civilization. Armies were raised to conquer neighboring lands, and for the first time, humans fought not just for food or safety, but for power. Blood stained the same soil that once nurtured the first crops. In Egypt, along the timeless flow of the Nile, civilization took on a divine rhythm. The river's annual floods sustained life, and its predictability gave birth to one of the most enduring cultures in history. Egyptians built their cities in harmony with the stars, believing their pharaohs were living gods, bridges between mortals and eternity. Under their rule, humans achieved architectural miracles that defy time. The pyramids of Giza, tombs of unimaginable scale and precision, built to house the souls of kings who dreamed of immortality. While Egypt and Mesopotamia thrived, the Indus Valley civilization rose quietly to the east, a marvel of planning and order. Their cities, like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, had straight roads, drainage systems, and uniform brickwork. There were no kings, no grand temples, no armies, only balance, trade, and remarkable social organization. Their society remains one of history's great mysteries, an example of civilization without tyranny. In China, along the Yellow River, the foundations of another great culture began to take shape. Early dynasties laid the groundwork for philosophies that would shape billions: harmony with nature, respect for ancestors, and the belief that moral order could guide the universe. Humans were beginning not only to shape their surroundings, but to understand their place within them. Technology leapt forward. Bronze smelting spread across continents, giving rise to stronger tools, sharper weapons, and grander artistry. Trade flourished. Obsidian, ivory, gold, silk, and spices passed between distant peoples. Humanity's networks stretched farther than ever, connecting worlds through curiosity and need. But the heart of this new age wasn't just invention, it was storytelling. Myths blossomed into the first written epics. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded the Epic of Gilgamesh, Asterisk, a tale of kings, friendship, and the quest for immortality. In Egypt, stories of gods like Osiris and Ra explained life, death, and rebirth. These myths were more than entertainment, they were mirrors, reflecting humanity's longing to understand its own existence. Religion and art became the soul of civilization. Temples were built, music echoed in palaces, and sculpture captured the beauty and pain of human life. For the first time, the human spirit found permanence in stone and ink. But even amid progress, the ancient world remained fragile. Floods could destroy crops, droughts could starve empires, and disease could erase entire generations. Humans had learned to build and rule, but they had not yet learned to control nature. Still, they adapted. Each disaster taught new lessons about resilience, community, and the limits of power. As centuries passed, civilizations rose and fell like the rivers that gave them life. Sumer gave way to Babylon, Egypt to new dynasties, and others emerged in their wake. Yet one truth endured: humanity's desire to create, to remember, and to leave something behind. When night fell over those early cities, people looked up at the same stars their ancestors once feared. But now they saw constellations, stories, gods, meaning written across the sky. In that cosmic tapestry, humanity had found its reflection. The age of civilization had begun with clay tablets and firelit temples, but its flame would grow, spreading knowledge, culture, and ambition across every corner of the world. Humanity was no longer just surviving history, it was writing it. Around 3,000 years ago, the heartbeat of civilization grew louder. The world that began in rivers and valleys now stretched across seas, mountains, and deserts. Humans had built kingdoms, discovered metals, and invented writing, but now they sought something greater: knowledge, power, and meaning. This was the dawn of the classical age, when thought itself became a weapon as mighty as any sword. In the East, great dynasties rose along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. In China, the Shang and Zhou dynasties refined bronze work, astronomy, and governance. Philosophers began to question not just how to live, but why. Confucius taught harmony through respect and morality, while Laozi's Taoism spoke of balance with the universe, wisdom drawn not from conquest, but from peace. These ideas would echo across thousands of years, shaping empires not yet born. To the west, in the Fertile Crescent, empires collided and fused. The Assyrians, masters of warfare, built vast armies and empires through iron and discipline. Babylon rose again, with its legendary gardens and astronomers who studied the heavens, seeking order in the stars. Their observations, cycles of the moon, eclipses, planetary paths, laid the first foundations of science. Humanity had begun to map not only the Earth, but the universe. Farther west, along the Nile, Egypt's power slowly waned. Its golden age of pharaohs gave way to foreign rulers, yet its legacy endured: pyramids touching the sky, hieroglyphs telling stories of gods and kings, and knowledge of medicine, mathematics, and architecture that would inspire generations. And beyond the deserts and mountains, a new force stirred the Mediterranean civilizations. On the islands of Greece, small city-states began to rise: Athens, Sparta, Corinth. They were divided by geography, but united by ambition. From them would emerge something entirely new: democracy, philosophy, and reason. In Athens, thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle dared to question the very nature of reality. They asked why the sun rose, what justice meant, what it meant to exist. Their words became the foundations of Western thought. At the same time, the Greeks sculpted marble into perfection, captured human beauty in form, and turned mythology into art that still shapes imagination today. But they were not alone in brilliance. Across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians mastered the seas, sailing from Lebanon to Africa, trading glass, metals, and purple dye. They created something even more powerful than ships: the alphabet, a simple system of symbols that would evolve into the language of the modern world. In India, along the Indus's descendants, new civilizations flourished. The Vedic period gave rise to the great spiritual texts known as the Vedas and Upanishads. Ideas of karma, dharma, and rebirth took shape, forming the foundation of Hinduism and influencing the birth of Buddhism. Under Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha humans began to look inward, searching for enlightenment, not through gods, but through understanding. The world was becoming connected by trade, conquest, and culture. In Persia, powerful kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius built empires that stretched from India to Egypt, ruling not through fear but tolerance. They built roads, postal systems, and the first true bureaucracy. Their rule became a model for governance that would inspire empires for millennia. In the Americas, far across oceans, unseen by the old world, civilizations were forming too. The Olmecs in Mesoamerica carved colossal stone heads, built ceremonial centers, and developed early writing and calendars. Though separated by oceans, their ingenuity mirrored humanity's global rise, proof that civilization was not the work of one people, but the destiny of many. Iron replaced bronze, changing the course of history. Weapons became sharper, tools more durable, and agriculture more efficient. Cities expanded, trade flourished, and wars became larger than ever before. Empires clashed and collapsed in waves: Hittites, Assyrians, Phoenicians, Mycenaeans, each leaving behind fragments of knowledge that others would build upon. And yet, amid this chaos, humanity's greatest invention quietly evolved philosophy. People everywhere began to ask questions beyond survival. What is justice? What is the soul? Why do we exist? In China, India, Greece, and the Middle East, thinkers rose simultaneously, as if the world itself had decided it was time to awaken. Religion too evolved, Gods became moral, not just powerful. The Hebrews introduced monotheism, a single God above all others whose covenant would shape thousands of years of belief and conflict. As centuries passed, these ideas intertwined faith, reason, law, and art, merging into a tapestry of civilization. No longer isolated, the world was becoming one web of exchange. Caravans crossed deserts carrying silken spices. Ships navigated stars across open seas. Ideas spread faster than ever. By the time the great empires of Persia, Greece, and later Rome emerged, humanity had already achieved something profound: the ability to reflect, to govern, and to dream as one species. As the night skies filled with the same stars their ancestors once feared, humans now charted constellations, named planets, and wrote myths to explain their light. They no longer saw themselves as small creatures beneath the heavens, they saw themselves as part of it. This was the classical age, when humanity learned not only how to build the world, but how to understand it. And from that understanding would come empires, revolutions, and philosophies that would shape the destiny of every generation to follow.